So the rest of this page tells us how to implement each function of this program. If we scroll down, and at the very bottom, we have a BlockPy canvas where we can write and submit our code. We get a little bit of code down here for free, which is really nice, but we're going to leave it alone because it's the main function, and the instructions say that that is the last function that we end up defining. So instead, we're going to just try running it and see what we get. You'll see that it's complaining in the feedback about the function named input username, saying, hey, it doesn't exist yet. If we go back up to the instructions, part 1, we see that it wants us to define the input username function. So this is where we're going to get started with writing some code. Let's read these instructions all the way through. Define a function named input username that consumes no parameters and returns a string value. The function will take user input, requesting the user enter their username, and then returns whatever they entered. The function should not print, but it does use the following as a prompt for the input function: what is your username? They also mention, because this function takes user input, we don't worry about testing it. Instead, we'll run the function in BlockPy, and it will tell us if it passes the instructor tests. So the computer will grade it for us and tell us if it's right. I want to highlight some of the important parts. This function takes no parameters. This is probably making you suspicious that it will take user input instead, and indeed, that is what it says. It says that it will take user input. If it's not going to have any parameters, it's going to have to get data from somewhere, and that often means user input. It does say that it does not print, it should not print, which means it's probably going to be returning a value, and indeed it says it returns a string value. So this is pretty critical information that we needed to parse from the description in order to get started on it. So now we'll go back down to the actual code, and we're going to define our input username function. We can actually do this either before or after main. We are able to define all the functions. We can't call the functions at the top level until we've defined them, but we can put their definitions in any order. So we'll define input username over here. We know that it needs to have the define keyword and the name of the function. The function does not take any parameters, so we don't put anything in the parentheses, but we still need the parentheses. And we know that it returns a string value. We could leave it with pass, but we're actually going to give some bit of documentation to explain what this function does. Put username. So 3 double quotes, and then inside of it we write, this function gets the user's username as a string. And we could document the parameters if there were any, or the return type, but we'll leave that. Well, let's put the return type at least. Returns a string representing the username of the user. Great. So that's step 1 of our process. Normally we would now write some unit tests, but they don't want us to. We don't need to. That's weird but convenient for us. Instead, we're just going to go straight to the body of the function. Now, if we try just running it right here, if we just try running our code, we get some feedback. And this will be a common practice for you, is running it periodically, even as you're writing it, to see what BlockPy can tell you. It's specifically telling us when we run this, hey, I ran your input username function. I found it, I ran it. It returned none, but I was expecting the result to be equal to ACBART. It was trying to put in some inputs, and it typed in ACBART, and it didn't get what it needed to. So we need to make it do some work. Now, if we go and look at the description they gave us before, they told us that it needed to use the built-in input function with the prompt that they gave us and return whatever the user types in. So the prompt was, what is your username, right? They want us to have this written out and prompt the user. For that, we use the built-in input function. Input is a function, takes in a string prompt. It ends up printing that out for us. And then the user gets to type something. in the box that appears, and that produces a string value. And this whole function is supposed to then return that string value. So what would happen if we wrote all that and we had a typo in the prompt? Let's make a very honest, simple mistake. We write the wrong your. So let's try running, seeing what it says. It says once again that we failed it. It entered as input ACBart. The function printed what is your username, but it expected the output what is your username, right? So like I say it out loud, it doesn't seem different, but it cares. It cares about every character in there, and they have to be the same. It's really specific, and I know that's annoying, but it's going to give us good feedback, and we have to start getting used to being really precise. I promise that we'll give you more freedom as you get further along, write more sophisticated programs, do later assignments. But for this one, we want you to be very specific. So let's go fix our function. Use the right your. Try running it again. Great. Okay, so it's no longer complaining about the input username function. Now it's talking about getPin, a completely different function, and it turns out that's the next one. So whenever it moves on to a new function, that's great news. It means we're making progress, and we can move on to the next step.